Now this is one of the best, easiest, and cheapest Frost Sorceress build for endgame in PoE 2. With this build you can easily clear tier 10 maps in around 5 minutes depending on the map layout and get tons of exalted orbs. With this build you can easily freeze enemies on the entire screen and then nuke the enemies down without taking any damage. This build can also constantly freeze bosses, allowing you to skip most of the boss's mechanics. Now for the Sorceress Ascendancies, I did choose Chronomancer to constantly freeze bosses, but this build will also work for the Stormweaver Ascendancy as well. And this build is not a meta build, so you can easily get gear for this build for extremely cheap. I have spent 1 exalted orb per gear for most of my gear, and at most you'll spend around 5 exalted orb per piece of gear unless the prices of gear increase. I'm going to showcase the skills, gear, and passive skill tree to easily dominate the end game, but there are certain key stats for this build to not feel sluggish, so I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing tier 10 maps in endgame. Now as of right now I'm level 79 and can easily clear tier 10 maps in around 5 minutes depending on the map layout. This build can easily freeze enemies and you can constantly freeze bosses and destroy them. Now this is not a meta build, so all the pieces of gear will be extremely cheap. So you can easily make this build and then farm maps to get tons of exalted orbs. And once you farm enough currency you can switch over to a meta build. Now the 2 main skills for this build will be Frost Wall to easily freeze all the enemies around you on the screen, and Comet to nuke enemies down while also constantly applying freeze as well. Now the main stats for this build will be to increase your cast speed so your Comet comes out faster and can't be interrupted, and getting tons of mana regeneration so you can constantly sustain casting Comets. Your mana will also be your health, because with this build you'll be taking the node Mind Over Matter on the passive skill tree, but I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections, and I'll have the full build layout in a build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the skills. Now all my skills are at most 4 link skills because I was unlucky in increasing my skill links. But if you have higher link skills, then most of the time you will want to add more damage to your skills. So the first skill I'm using is Comet, and this is our main damage dealing skill. And this skill will summon a Comet from the skies doing huge AoE damage while easily freezing enemies. And I paired this skill with Spell Echo to cast Comet 2 times in a row. And the second Comet will have more area effect, but in return this skill will have less cast speed. I also paired this skill with Arcane Tempo to increase its cast speed, and lastly I used Cold Mastery to increase the skill's level for more damage. And a very important note for this skill is that your cast time for your Comet has to be at least 1.56 seconds or faster. Do not get interrupted from attacks and not feel sluggish when using this skill. So as you can see, my cast time is at 1.52 seconds. The next skill I'm using is Frost Wall, and this skill will create ice walls to hold back enemies or explode on enemies to easily freeze them. This skill is important to easily freeze all the enemies on the entire screen. I paired this skill with Spell Cascade to create tons of frost walls, and this support spell is important to be able to fill the entire screen with frost walls. I also paired this skill with Glaciation to increase the freeze buildup, and lastly I'm using Font of Mana to increase my mana regeneration when using Frost Wall. The next skill I'm using is Frost Bomb, and this skill will do AoE damage that can slow and freeze enemies. Now this skill will be only used in certain situations. You're going to mostly use this skill on rare enemies that have the proximity mod or on bosses to do some extra damage. And I paired this skill with Fast Forward to speed up the activation, and Magnifying Effect to increase the AoE. I'm also using Cold Penetration to make this skill penetrate through cold resistant enemies. The next skill I'm using is Ice Nova, and this skill will do AoE damage around you, pushing back, slowing, and freezing enemies. And you're going to rarely use this skill unless you get surrounded by melee enemies or if you're trying to speedrun low level areas. And I paired this spell with Inspiration to reduce the mana cost, and Blind to blind enemies around you, but you can use any support gems for this skill. The next skill I'm using is Fireball, and this skill will launch a fireball which explodes on impact, then creating smaller firebolts in a nova. And you'll mainly be using this skill to finish off low life enemies or breaking down your frost walls to get through. And I paired this skill with Wild Shards to have a chance to fire 8 additional fireballs in a circle to cover the entire screen with fireballs. I also paired this skill with Scatter Shot to fire 2 additional fireballs and Concentrated Effect for more damage. The next skill I'm using is Eye of the Winter, and this skill will fire an orb projectile that fires shards in a circle. Now just like Fireball, this skill is only used to kill low life enemies. The only difference from this skill and Fireball is that this skill can go through frost walls. So if you want to hit enemies behind your frost wall, then this skill will be better to use. But other than that, Fireball will be slightly better for finishing low life enemies because it will do more damage. And I paired this skill with Acceleration to increase the projectile speed. I also paired this skill with Controlled Destruction and Consider considered casting to increase its damage. The next skill I'm using is Blasphemy, and this is a passive skill from the witch. So make sure you go to the witch passive skill to get this skill. And this skill will apply a curse skill to be an aura around you, so you don't need to cast your curse skill. I paired this skill with Hyperthermia to lower the enemy's cold resistance around you. I also paired this skill with Clarity to increase your mana regeneration. Now if you have more spirit, then you can use other support gems to increase its effectiveness. The next skill I'm using is Arctic Armor, and this is a passive skill that will conjure an icy barrier around you. The icy barrier will burst and freeze enemies and do cold damage around you when getting hit by a melee attack. Now this passive skill is really good for defense and survivability. I paired this skill with Frost Nexus to create a chill ground when you freeze an enemy, and Bludgeon to knock back enemies. Now the next two skills I'm using are the Ascendancy skills from the Chronomancer. So the next skill I'm using is Temporal Rift, and this skill will basically time travel you back to a previous location and resetting your life, mana, and energy shield at that time. This is a really strong survivability skill, allowing you to regain your life and mana if you take damage. And I paired this skill with Ingenuity to lower its cooldown, so you can constantly cast this skill if you're in dangerous situations. And the last skill I'm using is Time Freeze, and this skill will freeze all the enemies on the screen. This skill is really strong for offense and defense depending on your situation. With this skill you can easily freeze bosses and nuke them down, and have your other frost skills freeze the bosses as well, allowing you to constantly freeze the boss and skipping all the boss's mechanics. And for defense, this skill is really strong if you get surrounded by enemies and can easily freeze enemies around you to easily nuke them down. I paired this skill with Persistence to increase the time freeze duration, and Second Wind to be able to have another charge for emergency, but in return this skill will have a 50% less cooldown recovery. And lastly, I'm using Life Tap to convert the mana cost to life, because I'm using the node Mind Over Matter on the passive skill tree, which will drain your mana before life when you take damage. And if you get surrounded by enemies and they drain all your mana, you can still use this skill to get out of dangerous situations. Okay, so that's all the main skills I'm using for this build. But if you get higher skill links for your Comet skill, then you want to increase its damage by switching out the support skills from your other skills. And I'll have the full skill layout in a build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the gear. Now since this is not a meta build, the gear for this build will be extremely cheap. Most of the gear I have I was able to buy for 1 exalted orb, unless the price of gear increases, because to be honest it's very easy to get exalted orbs once you're in endgame. Now for the gear, the main base stats you want for your gear is either armor and or energy shield. And for the stats, first you want to max out all your resistance, because maxing out your resistance will allow you to easily survive the endgame and not get one-shotted. Now for the weapon and offhand, you're looking for mainly damage and to increase your cast speed. And on your armor pieces and jewelry, once you max out your resistance, you're looking for mana regeneration, max mana, max life, damage, and intelligence. Now in the build planner in the description below, I just listed the important stats you're looking for. So starting with the weapon, I'm using a wand so I can use an offhand, and I was able to buy this wand from the merchant. So always check the merchant, because sometimes they have really good gear. And for the stats, I have increased spell damage, increased cold damage, max mana, level to all cold spells, increased cast speed, and increased freeze buildup. Next for the offhand, I'm using a focus, and the stats I have is increased spell damage, increased cold damage, maximum mana, cast speed, intelligence, and increased mana regeneration. Next for the helmet, the stats I have is armor, maximum energy shield, increased armor and energy shield, maximum mana, intelligence, cold resistance, and life regeneration. Next for the body armor, the stats I have is armor, maximum energy shield, increased armor and energy shield, maximum life, cold resistance, lightning resistance, and chaos resistance. Next for the gloves, the stats I have is increased armor, adds lightning to attacks, maximum life, cold resistance, lightning resistance, and chaos resistance. Next for the boots. Now for the boots, the stats movement speed is important, and you want either 25% or 30% movement speed. I also have maximum energy shield, increased energy shield, intelligence, fire resistance, and chaos resistance. Next for the belt, the stats I have is reduced charm charges used, maximum life, increased flash recovery rate, increased charm effect duration, fire resistance, lightning resistance, and chaos resistance. Next for the amulet, the stats I have is life regeneration, increased spell damage, increased armor, maximum mana, increased all attributes, intelligence, and increased mana regeneration. Now for the first ring, the stats I have is chaos resistance, increased chaos damage, maximum life, intelligence, fire resistance, increased mana regeneration, and increased light radius. And for the second ring, the stats I have is fire resistance, increased chaos damage, maximum life, maximum mana, dexterity, all elemental resistance, and gain life per your enemy killed. And for the charm, I'm using a thawing charm because I feel like being frozen is one of the more common effects you get affected with. And being frozen, you can get easily killed. So this charm will help whenever you get frozen. And for the flask, for the life flask, I have instant recovery, but in return, the recovered amount is reduced by 50%. Now the instant recovery is very helpful even if you're losing half your recovered amount, because you can always spam your life flask. And with this build, your mana will be drained while taking damage before life because of the node Mind Over Matter on the passive skill tree. So you will be barely using your life flask. And for the mana flask, I have increased amount recovered because with this build you have tons of mana. And lastly, for the sockets for your gear, you want to use runes to increase your resistance to make sure you cap out all your resistance. So if you check out my stats, you can see all my resistance is capped out at 75%. And I'll have the full gear layout in a build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the passive skill tree. Now, depending on your stats, you want to focus the passive skill tree on cast speed, mana regeneration, and then damage in this order. But once you have enough cast speed and mana regeneration, you can focus entirely on increasing your damage. You want to have enough cast speed for your skill Comet cast time to be at 1.56 seconds or faster to avoid being interrupted and feeling sluggish. And you want enough mana regeneration to sustain casting Comet without draining your mana. Once you meet these conditions, then you want to focus entirely on damage. So on the passive skill tree, depending on your situation, you want to adjust your nodes depending on what is needed. So first I headed this way to get more spell damage. But if you need more mana regeneration, then I would remove these nodes that increase your spell damage for more mana regeneration here. Then I branched left to gain more mana regeneration, and then headed this way to increase my cast speed. Then heading up this way, I got Path of Winter to increase my cold damage and freeze build up. Then heading this way, I got Potent Incantation for increased spell damage, but in return this node will reduce your cast speed. But I do want to mention that if you don't have enough mana regeneration or cast speed, then you want to take the points out of here and apply to nodes for more mana regeneration or increased cast speed. So if you need more mana regeneration, then you want to take these nodes here and get Arcane Blossom. Then heading up and right this way. I took Climate Change to gain cold damage as extra fire damage or more damage, and heading this way to get Ruin to increase my spell damage, but in return reduce the area effect. And like before, if you need more mana regeneration or increased cast speed, you can take out points out of here and apply them elsewhere to gain more mana regeneration or increase your cast speed. I also took this Jewel node, and using jewels are really powerful that it will greatly increase your stats. And the stats you want on your jewels are either spell damage, cold damage, elemental damage, mana regeneration, cast speed, and or increase area effect. And since this is not a meta build, jewels for this build is really cheap. So for this jewel, I have spell damage, cold damage, and increased cast speed. Now heading left this way, I took this path to get Stormbreaker to increase my elemental damage. Then heading this way, I have this jewel that increases cold damage, cast speed, and mana regeneration, and also damage penetrates cold resistance. Then I headed this way to increase my mana regeneration, and I took Adverse Growth to recoup some mana when taking damage, but in return your life regeneration rate is reduced. Then heading this way, you want to take this node Mind Over Matter, and this node will make all damage take mana first before life, which is really good for survivability because this build has tons of mana, but in return you will lose 50% mana recovery rate. But with this build, since you are building tons of mana regeneration, this should not affect you too much. Then I headed this way to get Breaking Point to increase the freeze duration. Then I took All Natural to increase my elemental damage and resistance, and taking these nodes will increase your cast speed. Then I headed this way to take these nodes to increase my cast speed, and this node Overzealous to greatly increase my cast speed, but in return the mana cost of skills is increased. I have another powerful jewel that will increase my spell damage, cold damage, cast speed. Then heading back here and going up this way, I have another powerful jewel that will increase my spell damage, critical damage bonus, has recover mana on kill, and increase elemental damage. Then continuing heading up, I took these nodes to increase my cold damage. Then I took Endless Blizzard to gain +1 level to all cold skills for more damage. I also took Inescapable Cold to increase the freeze buildup and freeze duration on enemies. Then heading right this way, I went this path to gain more mana regeneration and took Raw Mana to increase my maximum mana, but in return my mana cost of skills will increase. And then I took Arcane Intensity to increase my spell damage per 100 maximum mana. And with this build you'll be building tons of mana, so this node will greatly increase your damage. Then I headed this way and took Eldritch Battery to convert all energy shield to mana. And since building mana will increase your damage, damage because of the arcane intensity node. This node will greatly increase your damage, and mana is also considered your life because of the node mind over matter. And since we are building tons of mana regeneration with this build, mana will recover faster than your energy shield, so having more maximum mana will be better than having energy shields. Then heading this way, I'm using this jewel, which will increase my spell damage, cold damage, critical hit chance with spells, and freeze threshold. Then heading down this way, I took these nodes to increase my cast speed, and took mental alacrity to increase my cast speed, mana regeneration, and intelligence. Then heading this way, I took these nodes to increase my cold damage. Now this node, heavy frost, is important, which will increase freeze build up, but most importantly, hits will ignore elemental resistance of frozen enemies. And with this build, you can easily freeze enemies, so this node will help greatly with enemies that are resistant to cold damage. So you don't really need to build cold resistance penetration with this build, and can get other stats. I also took thin ice, which will increase freeze build up and will greatly increase your damage to frozen enemies. And this node, harsh winter, to increase the cast speed with cold skills and increase skill effect duration. So that's all the passive skill points I have as of right now, and when I get more skill points, I will be heading down this way to increase my cast speed. But if you don't have enough cast speed, then I would take some points from some nodes that increases your damage and use it here to increase your cast speed, and you can get the damage nodes later. Now for the ascendancy points, I only have 6 ascendancy points as of right now. I was unlucky and never found the dungeon keys to unlock my last 2 ascendancy points, but I'll let you know where you want to put your last 2 ascendancy points. So for the first 2 ascendancy points, you want to get footprints in the sand to unlock the skill Temporal Rift, which is a really strong skill for survivability. And then the next 2 ascendancy points, you want to get ultimate command to unlock the skill Time Freeze, which is a very powerful skill offensively and defensively. And the next 2 ascendancy points, you want to get Apex of the Moment to automatically slow enemies around you, which is really strong for survivability. And the last 2 ascendancy points, you want to head this way to get Quicksand Hourglass to gain 50% more cast speed for 4 seconds for every 12 seconds. Okay, so that's the passive skill tree for this build as of right now. And depending on your stats, you want to focus your passive skill tree on increasing your cast speed, mana regeneration, and then damage in this order. But once you have enough cast speed and mana regeneration, then you can focus entirely on increasing your damage. So on the passive skill tree, depending on your situation, you want to adjust your nodes depending on what is needed. And I'll have the full passive skill tree layout in a build planner in the description below. Okay, and lastly, I want to show you that you need enough mana regeneration to sustain constantly casting Comet. So as you can see, when I'm casting Comet, my mana automatically refills itself to max because I have tons of mana regeneration with this build. And this is important so you don't easily run out of mana. Now, one tip if you're having issues sustaining your mana is to use a lower level skill gem for Comet, because using a lower level skill gem will reduce the mana cost, allowing you to sustain your mana more effectively. However, this comes at a cost of reduced damage from the skill. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, easiest, and cheapest Frost Sorceress build for endgame in PoE 2. With this build, you can easily clear tier 10 maps and freeze enemies on the entire screen. This build can constantly freeze bosses, allowing you to skip almost all the boss's mechanics and easily destroy them. This is not a meta build, so all the gear for this build will be extremely cheap. So you can easily make this build and then farm maps to get tons of exalted orbs. And once you farm enough currency, you can switch over to a meta build. And I'll have the full build layout in a build planner in the description below. Hope this helps in more PoE 2 videos to come, so stay tuned. And in the end,
there can be no salvation without sacrifice.